How would I describe art education in Australia? If you'd asked me that question 3 weeks ago, maybe a month ago, I would have answered it in a very different way, because at the moment it's under threat. It seems to be under threat, and people are guessing why, but it probably has a lot to do, as do most things, with money. However, up to this point, and certainly right to this very point, when we're facing the closure, the potential closure, certainly the diminution of Sydney University, art education in Australia continues to thrive, and we can see evidence of this at all levels, including the enormous coming out of support for what the threat was, or what the threat certainly still is, to Sydney College of Art, from all levels of the population, all age groups, and people from a range of different kinds of practices and audiences come up because they know that the visual arts is absolutely important to a contemporary Australian way of life. And one of the strongest instruments in bringing that to bear on our contemporary Australian way of life are the fabulous students that have gone out from these universities over several decades now. But I want to go a little bit closer to where we are now, to the point where art schools in Australia were forced into amalgamation, or invited to amalgamate with universities. So prior to that time and after that time, we can see significant differences. The biggest differences, I think, are in terms of time and space. Students had a lot more time to complete their degrees. We're now down to 12-week semesters and 2 semesters a year. We're about to move into trimesters. We're also looking at things like the time spent to do one subject, and one subject generally, or one course, is probably 3 hours a week. So significant reductions. And in terms of space, a lot of colleges are unable to offer students space to just produce in their own studio for the 3 years of their undergraduate. We used to have a 4-year undergraduate degree. Now we've got a compressed one. And in terms of space, I think that the high premium on space right across the country, also in the hire of studios, even in artist-run initiatives, means that space has become much more rare. Those would be the most significant things. The role of Australian art schools is to provide a matrix through which students can understand what's happened in the past and an awareness of what's happening right now. So between that art history and the awareness of the contemporary sphere, they've got a position that they can see themselves as operating within. They have an informed position of who's gone before them, what's happened before them, and the milieu in which they're working right now. So they have a kind of, there's an axis in which they can place their own realm for working, not to define it, but to have a kind of a shape within which to recognise what it is they're doing and to question what it is they're doing. The responsibilities that art schools have to their students are twofold. We're living in a particular era that emphasises student-led education, and we put a lot of money on students' assessment of the course and of the teachers. Where I come from, we call it student-evaluated teaching and student-evaluated courses, which ends up with the unfortunate acronym of the SETSEX that everybody waits for after every semester. My own personal feeling about those kinds of evaluations is that they'd be better asked 10 years down the track. It's like polling in politics. You go for a personality and it may not be the person that's given you the real deal in the long run. So the responsibility has to be for the students, but it also has to be to do with art. The responsibility is to the lineage of art. I think the institutions, the art colleges have to keep that in mind. Have to keep in mind that art has always been something that's been about risk-taking, about self-criticality, and an art institution that's not prepared to turn its scrutiny, its critical scrutiny, back onto itself, probably should close its doors. If you ask me whether art schools are fulfilling their mandates, I think to a greater and lesser degree they are, but certainly I think this is not the time to think it's time to evacuate. There are problems at the moment because there are problems right across all industries and sectors, and they have to do at the bottom line with money, and at that same bottom line, the way we assess how we're achieving has to do with quantifiable indicators. But if we look at the quality of indication about where we are as a nation, or as a culture, I think that art schools have done a wonderful job in bringing alive an awareness that what we're doing comes from a particular time and space that makes it unique. Now, in the institution that I come from, we've run a very small course which started with the name of Bovakaya, which was about Bachelor of Visual Art, Contemporary Visual Arts for Indigenous people. And it was taught and still is taught by Indigenous people. And because of that course, the rise in awareness, even to an international level, of what contemporary Indigenous art is and how it contributes to all of us as Australians has been absolutely profound. So there's been people associated with Kaya, like Jennifer Hurd, like Vernon Arkey, Gordon Hookey, Tony Alberts, Richard Bell, who've changed the idea of what it means to be a contemporary Australian. And that is a tiny investment for an enormous outcome. From my point of view at the moment, there's a terrible oversight right across the country about the opportunity that we had and still have of seeing ourselves and our own cultural development in the broader terms of the Asia-Pacific region. There's been a blind spot to that. In 1993, when I was first involved with the Asia-Pacific Triennial, we could see the first glimpses of comparisons about how modernism affected the countries in the region. We've had new books on international globalisation, but we haven't had many books yet, and no courses in tertiary institutions as yet, which look keenly at the development of Australian art and cultural practice in terms of the Asia-Pacific region. That's a huge oversight. Another opportunity for enhancing art education would be that the benefits of having Indigenous protocols as part and parcel of every art education across this country. So that the two fears, I think, that unfortunately characterise Australia for many, many decades, fear of the heart and fear of the edges, fear of the Indigenous heart and fear of the Asian edges gets obliterated, so that we can see that what makes us unique is that Indigenous heartland and the place in the Asia-Pacific region that is so unique in terms of the rest of the globe. I know that in Australia's representation in Documenta coming up next year, 2 of the 3 graduates came from a tertiary education. One still enrolled in his doctorate there, and one did his master's there, Gordon Hookey. And the third person from Sydney, Benita, also is involved in tertiary art education. And if you look at the representation of artists in survey exhibitions like biennales across the world and in Australia, you'll see that most of them, I think, arguably have a tertiary art education. So it's something that should be absolutely preserved, which is not to say that it is the be-all and end-all, but art's fought hard to win recognition that it's a viable form of practice which can be called research and is valuable in many ways that are both quantifiable, and we've done that, and non-quantifiable, and perhaps that's the most important of all. So for us to think that tertiary art education doesn't matter would be an enormous oversight at this point in time, because education of any kind is a liberating process, and it can be for arts just as much as anything else.